Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I was listening to that outline with, well, in some ways, a sinking feeling because you're already doing everything I'd want to talk about, I think, and in many ways, way ahead of us in terms of a collective. So, inspiring, brilliant to hear how organised you are, and that there are so many people involved. So, but yeah, thank you. Thanks to Agnes and to the Kritische about psychology, excuse my pronunciation, and for allowing me to speak in English as well. That's much appreciated. It's a pleasure, privilege to share my perspective on critical psychologies of climate change. I'd agree with some of what's already been said. My perspectives are born out of a sense of frustration with psychology in the UK and a sense of curiosity and interdisciplinary curiosity and kind of following my nose, really, I think. So I'm certainly not here to share any formed perspective on what critical psychology should be, more meandering than that. As I said to Agnes, it's going to be a short talk, 20 to 30 minutes max, because I've just signed up to a project on an unrelated issue and I'm deep in it at the moment. So I just don't feel that familiar with this at the moment to be going on for too long. It's all connected. It's critical psychology of human-animal relations, but it's not quite the same area, and I'm just immersed in that. So what I'm going to do is I'll say a little bit about myself for a moment. Then I'm going to share my perspective on the role of psychological discourses to date in making the sense of the climate crisis. Like I say, really just echoing lots of what's already been said about this group. I'll talk about the importance in recent developments about recognizing effective and emotional responses to climate crisis, really important for me, and an important part of recent work, I think, especially as the basis for meaningful action. And then I'm just going to try and draw together in an ad hoc, not particularly sophisticated way, different work providing an emphasis on place and community and power. I guess are the three things in there. Yeah, so bear with me. So first of all, a bit about me. I always feel a bit funny about doing this, but I am here. So I'm going to talk about myself for a minute. Originally, where have I come from? It's kind of social theory background, critical psychology too. So I'm steeped in those kind of two traditions. Critical psychology in the kind of North American, particularly English versions. I kind of moved into environmental issues after a moment of serendipity, and then climate crisis, human nature connection. I kind of turned the bus around and start to focus my research and reading interests on those areas. And engaging with at the time, so this is about 10, 12 years ago now, kind of emerging fields as they were then, like eco-psychology, predominantly in North America at the time, but it's kind of spread a bit since. In fact, predominantly it was on the West Coast of the US. And climate psychology since then, which again has kind of got a stronger presence in the UK, I think, but certainly spreading, which is a critical approach to climate change using psychology and psychotherapy. And interdisciplinary developments that I'm curious about, like the environmental humanities, post-humanities, environmental philosophy, and so on. So plenty of breadth so far, if not depth. A consistent thread for me, if I look back, which talking today encouraged me to do, has been my own struggle to articulate and advocate for a relational ontology. That's always been key to what I'm interested in, and a kind of politically informed perspectives on, at first, human development, identity, belonging, human-human relationships. But more recently, I've tried to think those through in terms of human and more than human relations, human, non-human relations, human nature relations. And it's that relational ontology that's at the heart of what I do, if I do anything. Yeah, but in recent years, more practically, I've been engaged in debates critiquing psychological perspectives on the climate crisis, particularly in the UK. And more recently, this idea of the Anthropocene, advocating for more critical approaches, trying to prompt also in the UK and in the US, the field of critical psychology itself to take on board climate and ecological issues. It's been really slow to do so, even critical perspectives in the UK and US to address climate change and related issues. So I think, at least I get away with it in most of these titles, I'm taking a consistently critical psychological perspective towards these issues. And my critique is directed towards the theories, methods, and practices of psychology as a discipline and as a professional body. The other thing I've been trying to do in more recent years, it can often feel like, I'm sure this will be familiar to many of you, it can often feel like we're talking to the same people or in an echo chamber. So I've made an effort to try and get some of the insights of critical psychology and their arguments in relatively straightforward terms out there, so to speak, in the hope of trying to reach a wider public, while trying to hang on to that inherently political perspective. So yeah, that's been mixed in terms of how that's gone, in terms of the reception you get, but certainly read by more people than my academic work tends to be. So there's something in that, I hope. Yes, anyway, so that's enough about me, I'm sure. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the role of mainstream psychological discourses. I'm not really using slides, I should have said this, as bullet points. I'm just using various images and just get rid of my teenage daughter telling me my dinner's ready. She must have forgotten. Yeah, I'm just in this, so I'll be there in about an hour. And yes, so I'm just using slides here as images and prompts, really, rather than bullet points. Yes, so mainstream psychological discourses to date, how have they made sense of the climate crisis? You're already onto this, clearly, by that brief summary. Something I'm sure your group are familiar with. Agnes, in fact, shared with me earlier as well, in the lead up to this, your disillusionment with mainstream environmental psychology. And of course, there's a strong tradition of critical psychology in Germany as well as elsewhere. It's a problem too for official psychology's bodies. Our own British Psychological Society shared its psychological manifesto. Here it is, leading up to the last UK election, late 2019. Lots happened in UK parliamentary politics since. In fact, much of the manifesto was welcome. There was a strong call for parties to commit to address underlying structural determinations, sometimes of ill health, for example, and inequalities. I was intrigued to hear what they'd say about the climate and ecological crisis. There was nothing at all, not even a mention of it. This was at a time, as today, when politicians, charities, protesters, young people are coming out onto the streets, other professional bodies too, even the British Medical Association, all sharing the same message in a way that the climate crisis now requires immediate collective social political action. But nothing from psychology, the official body. That kind of consternated me, but also made me curious and chimed with various perspectives I've got on psychology. But in terms of why the blind spot, I think that's because psychological approaches to climate change have tended to focus on individual behaviour change, haven't they? As you know, decision-making processes, communicating pro-environmental messages. How do you get people to recycle, buy electric cars? And it's been really similar in the US. The American Psychological Association is really happy to position psychological expertise as a resource, effectively, to be tapped by organizations and policymakers keen to help people adapt to a warming world, as they put it. As the APA call to climate action state, so this is their call to climate action, we're the experts on individual behaviour. We know about messaging and how to create interventions. And the BPS manifesto similarly emphasises the power of evidence-based behaviour changed interventions, if not in relation to the climate crisis. So the problem, I think, for a discipline that's effectively enthralled to tinkering with individual behaviour change is that it completely misses the bigger picture, the wider social, political, cultural processes and alliances that perpetuate climate change as a social problem. It just doesn't enter the picture to the extent that it's not even part of a psychological manifesto in the UK. Of course, human activity is centrally implicated in ecological degradation, and it follows, of course, that changes in human activity are a route to a more sustainable society. It's possible then, as Koger and Winter said in this really well-known US textbook on psychology of environmental problems, to understand ecological crisis as an issue for psychology in this way. With this quote, we don't necessarily have to agree with their model of causation. I mean, for me, thoughts, beliefs, values, worldviews might equally be retrospective justifications for the way we act. And they don't distinguish between different types of human or different behaviors. But we see their point. The problems we're addressing should really be located somewhere in relation to human activity, and therefore potentially psychology, rather than out there in the environment or in technical solutions. Naomi Klein said something not that different. The solution to global warming is not to fix the world, it's to fix ourselves. If we take this as a standard psychological explanation, then some issues are immediately apparent. Again, you're fully aware of these, so apologies if this is stuff that's just very familiar to you. If the focus is on individual activities, we can see why policymakers, campaign groups, and environmentalist commentators might welcome psychology. Come on in if it tries to address individual behavior change. If the problem boils down to many individual acts of consumption, recycling, travel, switching things on or off, then it makes sense to target and change those behaviors. APA, as I said, right behind this, American Psychological Association. This is the climate task force now. The logic here asserts the power of psychology to identify discrete variables, largely psychological in origin, within the individual, intrapsychic, and the interventionist goal is then to highlight them in communication campaigns and presumably cause behavior to change in the right direction, against a largely inert backdrop, the environment. Now, in the UK and US psychology, certainly until recently, even work addressing social barriers to sustainable behavior, there's a deceptive, I would say deceptive, consensus about which human activities in particular we are trying to address. It's deceptive because the specifics are often left unsaid, but implied to be individual acts of consumption. Too many goods, too much energy, wrong goods. So psychology in this context must be utilized to understand the barriers to or enablers of consuming less or differently. Now, of course, you already know this. This is an unnecessarily narrow definition of relevant human activity, which encourages reductive and apolitical understandings of the social, some kind of backdrop of levers and pulleys that push and pull individual behavior this way and that, rather than any sense of a interrelated social, psychological, historical, cultural dynamics. And this reflects psychology's history in parts from 1985 from Brzezinski's article. So critiques of psychology have long been aware of this. Of what? Of psychology's history as a handmaiden of establishment institutions and orthodoxies. This history should be a warning to us. There's a danger here in psychologies of or environmental psychology or psychology of climate change of playing a game of mutual collusion, looking busy in our disciplinary activities whilst helping to maintain an unsustainable status quo. I could say more, but I get the feeling from the way this talk was introduced that we know all this already as a collective, and things are changing. And part of the reason I agreed to write the piece for Current Opinion in Psychology, which is the same title as this presentation, Critical Psychologies of Climate Change, is because they asked me to purposely limit it to the past 5 years. And I found that really helpful and interesting, and I enjoyed the opportunity to look across the field and look for new developments. I'm just going to talk about a couple of those now and expand on them a little bit. This is an image by Jason de Queiroz Taylor's underwater sculpture called Anthropocene. So the first area that I'm aware of and I've recognized and would like to say a little bit more about is work recognizing the effective and emotional responses to climate crisis in psychology, such as ecological grief, an emotional experience brought on by actual or anticipated loss of cherished natural spaces, ecosystems, species, caused by environmental change. Eco-anxiety means something similar, but more popular usage of heightened distress in response to ecological, social, cultural threats we're facing in relation to climate crisis. Solastalgia, probably a more familiar one. It's got a longer history. Feeling homesick or something like homesickness while still at home. Glenn Albrecht, the lived experience of negatively perceived environmental change in another description. And Timothy Clark's Anthropocene horror, a sense of horror about the changing environment globally, usually in this context is mediated by news reports and expert predictions, giving a sense of threats that need not be anchored in any particular place, but which are both everywhere and anywhere. And I do cover some of that work in that paper, and I have elsewhere. And yeah, I think it's a really important move. I'll say why. But a critical psychology for me, first of all, is not necessarily interested in eco-anxiety et al. As a problem to be solved, and certainly not as a condition to be medicated. Of course, as critical psychologists, we should be wary of using psychologizing and clinical terms uncritically. Certainly in this case, it can make us feel there's something wrong with us for feeling distress in relation to changes in our climate and wider social and political systems, when in fact it's a very sensible response. This has been key to the work of the Climate Psychology Alliance in the UK. I don't know if you've come across that before. It's a collective of clinical psychologists, psychotherapists, and others, academic psychologists like me, who are trying to tackle the climate crisis from a critical perspective, drawing on psychology. And yeah, I agree with them that recognizing some of the complex affective and emotional responses to climate crisis is an important encounter with our awareness of our impact on the world and the reality that the world is facing a climate emergency. It's a lot more complex still in terms of emotional responses. It's highly differentiated depending on place where we are in the world and our particular histories and our relationship to power. Should we be scared? Yes. We do need to face up to the realities of the climate crisis, both in terms of how they're affecting people now, how the emergency intersects with existing inequalities, and for those of us not feeling the brunt just yet, anticipated and projected fear and loss, including, really important, I think, loss of comfort, identity, and lifestyle need to be part of explicit psychological discourse. Nothing new necessarily. The late eminent German sociologist Ulrich Beck, risk, uncertainty was his focus. But he described the hardcore sociological question of contemporary times quite portentously in this way. Where is the support for ecological changes supposed to come from? The support in which many cases will undermine people's lifestyles, consumption habits, social status, and life conditions in what are already truly very uncertain times. I still don't think we have an answer to that question yet. But addressing this threat to people's lifestyle and how they fear that amongst those relatively well-off people in relatively well-off countries, that niche is certainly important. Anticipation itself can be terrifying when we have to consider that, for example, that sometime in the next few decades, now really, whether by force or choice, and I'm quoting Leslie Head, the geographer now, we will have to decarbonize so dramatically that many choices, some of us, we, take for granted in contemporary life will no longer be possible. So the complexity of guilt, fantasy, fear that's involved in responding in any way to that kind of anticipation is complex, it's partly psychological, and it's now being reflected in research inspired by critical psychology, various versions of it, psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic theory, and there's all sorts of work being done. And particularly a focus of mine has been how when people are confronted with ecological degradation, information about it, facts. It triggers an uncomfortable emotional response individually, but also collectively, which triggers more complex psychological dynamics and social dynamics, defense mechanisms. What's potentially fascinating for critical psychology in this context is the fundamentally social character of defense mechanisms, and I would argue the political character of them. They're interpersonal, they develop in interpersonal conversations, through the media, in silences and gestures. They follow the contours of a cultural stock of prescribed narratives, according to sociologists like Harry Norgaard, and they amount to shared collective denial strategies often. So if that's true, then we can't underestimate the importance of addressing these responses as the basis for an appropriate collective response. So, in fact, theory of defense mechanisms would suggest that as the crisis deepens, which of course it does every day, as the walls close in, we tend to double down on these defenses. Defense mechanisms work in that way. Perhaps there's evidence of that in today's newspaper in the UK, in The Guardian, reporting on a survey that shows as concern about climate. As the climate threat grows, concern about the climate change appears to be shrinking. We could argue this is a defense mechanism, not just an individual psychological one, but a reflection of a wider greenwashing process, but also kind of inertia amongst incumbent political and corporate allegiances. Defense mechanism theory predicts that as the crisis deepens and we double down on defense mechanisms, what do? We might idealize charismatic leaders, polarization kicks in, firmer in-group and out-group boundaries, out-group denigration, reactionary populism, as this image suggests, are all predicted by this kind of reaching for defense mechanisms individually and collectively in the face of really profound ontological as well as material threats. So yeah, I think critical psychology has got a role in acknowledging this fear, the contours of this fear, as part of facing up to this situation. We need to do much more not to leave fear and anxiety as experienced but unsaid and unseen, where we can then portion it off as defenses and find ways to individually and collectively articulate and recognize and work with fear and other emotions to try and confront the reality of the climate crisis. We now see research under the banner of psychology and critical psychology doing more than just identifying emotions, but encouraging the development of collective, supportive, conducive environments in which anxieties are collectively confronted as a basis for change. We see that in research, but also in activism. A willingness there to ask radical questions about the stories we tell ourselves now and in the future. The stories that we seem to be trapped in, but have stopped making sense. And starting to consider which alternative narratives and responses might make better sense and might flourish. But also, and this is really important, this is for me, and this is leading on to my second broad area. If we go back to Beck's hardcore question, and we think about these defense mechanisms and effective responses, they don't speak to everyone's experience globally. Of course not. Actually, a pretty narrow section of the global population in some ways. So we need to address that broader complexity, and that's my second broad theme, that recent work has expanded critical understandings of the psychological processes involved, sure, but also how those processes are rooted through not just politics and interpersonal relations, but place. This image is from the National Geographic. It's Mount Thorley Warkworth coal mine in Australia's Hunter Valley, one of several super pit clusters. Operates 365 days a year, provides jobs. The owner is currently planning to expand it, but lots of people live around here as well. And one of the residents quoted in the National Geographic says the massive mine has created a sense of sorrow among them. It's not just grieving for what has been, it's also for grieving for what could be and will now not be. This is a kind of sorrow or melancholy rooted in place. And there's increasing amount of work that recognizes this place-based experience. I think that's really important for accounts of how trauma and distress are distributed geographically and socially in uneven, unequal, and unjust ways. That's essential for me as psychology is going to move forward to recognize that. Individuals and communities disproportionately bearing the brunt of the effects of extractivism, anthropogenic climate change, ecological degradation, and often in light of their relative contribution to the problem being less, a double injustice as it's referred to in the literature. So in terms of place-based work, this image is from The Guardian. There's children at play at dusk in the Inuit community of Labrador. Ashley Kunselow's work is important here, adding to this burgeoning body of scholarship by focusing on the various forms of ecological loss and grief experienced by people in places like Labrador, Canada, Inuit people. Caribou herds, for example, central to Indigenous Inuit culture, sustenance, identity for generations, witnessed a rapid decline as a result of climate change. And what's happening with Ashley Kunselow's work is Inuit-led research, so engaging with Indigenous populations using in-depth interviews, particularly complex, to reveal lived experiences of ecological grief, mourning, and so on in response to caribou population decline. For me, that's a really nice example of critical work, empirically centering understanding of effect and emotion in terms of geography and power, whilst extending a conceptualization of the complex emotions involved. Whereas in parallel, and this is a little bit, I'm being a little bit polarizing myself here, now I'm presenting it, I feel that. But in mainstream psychological discourses, we're getting a shift towards a tendency to locate these kinds of experiences within a medical or quasi-medical framework. I noted this earlier, but we see it happening with these emotional responses too. There's an attempt to come up with scales that can measure eco-anxiety, for example. So for me, the role of critical psychology in this context, especially where in UK and North American traditions, there's been a strong focus in critical psychology on discourse and discursive analysis. So where discourse is a key concept, a methodological tool, it can identify and resist moves like this to try and quasi-medicalize or individualize emotional responses, challenge those discourse, loosen those experiences of distress from their social, political, and historical moorings. This kind of work, we can bring it back. Yes, empirical research in critical psychology in this context can highlight how these kinds of discourses circulate to, how they can become dominant, how they can be resisted, and how such experiences are grounded in meaningful readings of reality. There's not much of this kind of work yet, but I think it can be applied here. Yeah, I think a really nice example, positive example where this kind of work is being done is especially in Global South and Indigenous communities is Garrett Barnwell and colleagues' work, particular concept of place severing. So it's still about emotional responses, but it's based in place, and it's about connecting those experiences to, as the quote says here, older knowledge systems, geographical connections to space, and older histories stemming from colonialism, post-colonialism, extractivism, and so on, and paying attention to those dynamics as well. But what's also really important about this work, I think, and this is the final step I want to make really, is that it's not just about negative emotional responses. It's also about trying to address and locate and even facilitate moments where grassroots organizing groups, collectives, have a role in promoting community mobilization, critical thinking, building alliances in response to these kinds of threats, empowering communities. So the study of power in this context is emphatically not limited to vulnerable, passive, vulnerable groups and communities, chronically disempowered by climate change. But it's also about the study of the opportunities, moments for empowerment, where that might happen. And of course, that also means how and where communities are sometimes compromised or compromising with extractive industries, government institutions, and so on. And it's about a recognition then and working alongside those groups that are already acknowledging and challenging deeper injustices and systems across the world, including in Indigenous communities in the Global South. So arguably in critical psychology, and certainly in critical community psychology, the process of undertaking psychological research should explicitly find ways to assist and accompany communities seeking to resist and remedy land, climate, and environmental injustices. So, in conclusion, nearly there, folks, thanks for your patience. I've shared my perspective on the role of psychological discourses, particularly mainstream ones to date, in making sense of the climate crisis. I get the feeling you're already familiar with those. I've talked about the importance for me of the shift to recognise effective and emotional responses. And I've also talked a bit about other work addressing that I think is really important: place, community, power, and discourse, if briefly. Stasis, inaction, individual barriers in the face of anthropogenic ecological degradation is a psychological issue, but for me, only as much as it intersects with political, social, cultural issues. What we need to do is find ways to articulate and recognize and work with fantasies, fear, other emotions, individually and collectively. But we have other roles as individual psychologists as well, and as individuals. I don't like to be prescriptive. I feel like for me, this feeds into an individualization of the problem and into simplistic in-group, out-group enemy narratives. There's a danger of that, but there are things we can do. We can encourage, supervise, support, examine good research. We can be selective. And by good, I mean research that engages meaningfully, critically, and compassionately with the climate crisis. And that includes cultures, for me, really, it should include cultures of successful activism. We can pressure the organizations we work with and for to adopt more progressive narratives and practices. And we can call out ineffective, counterproductive, and unethical practice in psychology and as psychologists. And of course, we can talk to and with activist groups. We can also carry on finding ways to deal with our own distress, our own emotional response to the climate crisis, and of course, seek conversation and connection, as we are doing today. I'll leave the final word to Steffi Bednarek, a clinical psychologist, psychotherapist in the UK. Says that what we need most in the face of trauma and turmoil, is friends, to nature and to ourselves, and compassion for others and ourselves. This is lacking for many people still in our culture. I'll leave it there. Thank you.